what I want to really talk to you about is, and what Emily asked me to do is just talk a little bit about why we do what we do and how we do what we do. We being the Institutional Review Board, and so I've got lots and lots of stuff. I love history, so I'm content to talk with you for hours on history. But I suspect most people don't particularly want that. I love ethics, so I'm content to talk to you for hours on ethics. But again, there's no way to, there's no sure way to make sure that everybody here falls asleep. So I'm going to touch on those things. I do want to talk a little bit about history because it does set the stage for why we do. I do want to talk about ethics because even though we follow a bunch of regulations, those regulations are based on a foundation of ethics, and the ethics flows from the history. So I think it's important. But at any point that anybody's really bored or really tired and you want to leave, I won't be offended. I have thick skin. But I also would encourage people to stop me in the middle, and we can talk. And if this goes off the track, we can talk. I can do this stuff without slides as well. But let's get started. And at the point that I'm staring at Lisa Runco, and at the point that Lisa yawns or keels over, then I'll know it's time to stop. Okay. So I just, like I say, I want to talk a little bit about history because I think it sets the tone for why there are IRBs and why IRBs do what we're supposed to do. And I lead off with a quote from the philosopher George Santayana from The Life of Reason in 1905. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And the picture, of course, is the gate at the Dachau concentration camp. Arbach macht frei, work will set you free. The era of modern research ethics probably begins here, or more accurately begins here, which is the doc at the Nuremberg doctor's trial, the medical trial, the United States versus Karl Brandt. Karl Brandt is the surly-looking character in the front row at the extreme left of the picture. And this was an important trial. It was one of the many war crimes trials after the Second World War. This was a little bit different because there were 23 defendants charged with a variety of crimes against humanity and war crimes related to the medical experiments that took place in the concentration camps before and during the Second World War. 20 out of the 23 were physicians, and they weren't the dregs of German medical society. Most of them had been deans of medical schools or heads of medical departments before the war and during the war. Brandt was Hitler's physician, but he was also the head of the Reich Research Council. You have in here the head of the German Red Cross, the various physicians at the various concentration camps. So these were the top people, and obviously there were lots and lots of people below them, but these were the ones who, before the war, were the sort of the paradigms of German medicine, and during the war were the criminals who conducted these experiments. The indictment described 32 known experiments that were taken place between 1942 and 1945. I don't need to describe the experiments, although I will describe one of them to you, but just the titles will give you an idea of the kind of thing that was going on. There was experimental surgery done at Ravensbrück concentration camp, malaria experiments at Dachau, sterilization research at Auschwitz, typhus experiments at Buchenwald, mustard gas experiments at Sachsenhausen and Matzweiler, and freezing experiments done at Dachau concentration camps. And you can have some sort of, everybody knows a little bit about them, and you can get a vision of what was going on just by the titles. But one of the ones that's best documented were the high altitude experiments done at Dachau in 1942. And most of these experiments were, to a greater or lesser degree, set up as scientific experiments. There were aims, there were methods, there were statistics, there were conclusions, or at least some of them were set up that way. And most of them had some sort of they were there for a purpose. The high altitude experiments, for example, were trying to collect data that would be necessary, that would have been useful to the German Air Force. They had bomber crews who were flying at high altitudes. They wanted to know what happened to aviators at high altitudes. They wanted to know what happened to aviators who had to bail out of their airplanes at high altitudes. what was the physiologic changes that would occur. So in these series of experiments, the objective was to measure the reaction of human beings at very high altitude, and they used a barometric chamber that simulated altitudes up to 68,000 feet. There were 200 prisoners that were exposed to low pressure with or without oxygen, or to rapid changes in pressure in various iterations of the experiments. And in some of the experiments, the endpoint written into the study was the death of the subject, so an autopsy could be performed. The picture is most of these studies were actually very well documented, and the picture is a Russian prisoner who's being exposed to low pressure, and his ears are popping. That's why he looks so pained. The justification for using human subjects was laid out nicely in a letter from Sigmund Rascher, who was one of the Nazis who conducted the experiments. Although he never came to trial, he died under mysterious circumstances before the end of the war. But in any case, he wrote to Heinrich Himmler, Dear Reich leader, the experiments will be conducted at the Air Force ground level testing station for high altitude research. Experiments during which test persons may die cannot be conducted with monkeys, since monkeys react differently. And this is a picture from one of the autopsies. What you see here is the top of the head of a subject. The skull cap has been removed. The brain is being lifted out of the skull, and the cause of death in many of these cases was subdural hematoma, was collection of blood around the brain due to the rapid changes in pressure. So the defense offered a variety of different excuses for their participation. Prisoners were condemned to die anyway. The research was justified to perform the state, so on and so forth. The two that probably hold the strongest fascination are and probably the best legal standing were the argument that there was a lack of written legal standards under which the doctors could decide what they should and shouldn't do, and therefore under which they should be prosecuted. And also the observation that the use of prisoners as research subjects was a universally accepted practice. It's from the transcript. One of the lawyers for one of the defendants said, experiments which time and again have been described in international literature, that is experiments on prisoners, without meeting any opposition, do not constitute a crime from any medical point of view. In view of the complete lack of written legal norms, the physician has to rely on and refer to the admissibility of what is generally recognized to be admissible all over the world. So what he was saying was, this kind of thing has been published extensively. Nobody's complained until now. Therefore, it must be acceptable. They also just pointed out the fact that prisoners were the participants, the subjects of research in a variety of different published studies, including some done in the United States. The cholera studies in Bilibid prison in Manila, which at the time was a U.S. protectorate, led to 13 deaths among 24 subjects. So what the Americans were doing certainly wasn't benign either. Pointed out the pellagra experiments done at Rankin Prisoner Farm near Jackson, Mississippi, but probably the most prominent case was that of the malaria experiments that were done at Stateville Penitentiary. And this is actually a picture from Life magazine. I don't think anybody here, well, maybe I'm old enough to remember Life magazine, but this was something that had broad exposure to the U.S. public, and they were rather proud of this experiment. And what you see here is a prisoner at the penitentiary, those two glass bulbs containing mosquitoes that are infected with malaria. And so this was a way of making sure that the subject was inoculated with malaria. The guy entirely too close was the investigator. Obviously, this was a photo that was created, but nonetheless, this was part of a series of experiments that was done to try to reduce the mortality and morbidity associated with infectious disease. More soldiers in the United States died from infectious disease than they did from gunshot wounds during the Second World War. So this was important information, and it was done. The research was done on prisoners, and some manifestation of informed consent was presented. This is from the the consent form, I hereby declare that I've read and clearly understood the above notice. I hereby accept all risk associated with the experiment and absolve from liability the University of Chicago, which sponsored the experiment, the state of Illinois, the warden of the state penitentiary, and it was done there was remuneration in the amount of X number of dollars. So the outcome of the Nuremberg trials, of the medical trial, was that sentences were returned in August of 1947, and 7 of the defendants were sentenced to death, including Brandt, Gebhardt, Hoven, Sievers, and some others, and none others received prison terms related to their conduct during these experiments. But more important than came out of perhaps out of the Nuremberg medical trial was a recognition by the judges, by the 3-judge panel, that there needed to be some sort of disclosure of information. There needed to be some sort of a process that came out of the trials that laid out what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable in terms of human subject research. What the judges said was certain types of medical experiments on human beings, when kept within reasonably well-defined bounds, conform to the ethics of the medical profession generally. All agree, however, that certain basic principles must be observed in order to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal contexts in the practice of human experimentation. And those basic principles were the Nuremberg Code. Now, the Nuremberg Code was a legal code. It had authority only in the area that was under the protection of the Allied Control Council. It was meant, from a legal point of view, it had no authority outside of the occupied Germany, but the judges did intend for it to serve as a model for what the principles are that should govern human subject research in other locations, including in England and the United States and Europe. The Nuremberg Code basically lays out these 10 features. Voluntary consent is essential, that the research will yield results that are not otherwise obtainable, should be based on animal experiments, conducted to avoid physical and mental suffering. Think about that, the high altitude experiments and what you can imagine of some of those other experiments, and then think about it in the context of these basic ethical principles. It should be not done if injury is expected. The risk should be less than the importance of the problem. Facilities available to protect the subject from injury, conducted by qualified people. The subject may end participation in the research at any time, and the investigator must be prepared to end the research if he believes that the subjects will suffer. Now, when I describe these, the Nuremberg Code to people now, it's actually kind of, I'm gratified that people look at it and say, it's obvious why was this such a big deal? Because it is obvious to us now, and it is sort of the basis, the bedrock on which we build human subject research. The Nuremberg Code, or something similar to the Nuremberg Code. The fact that voluntary consent is essential is the first principle of this code should surprise no one. Both the fact that it should be the first principle, but that it is one of the principles. Yet it was surprising, and it was surprising not only to the Germans in the dock, but to American physicians. And in fact, the Nuremberg Code did not have any authority in the United States, but as a set of ethical principles, had very little traction among medical scientists in the United States, among physician scientists in the United States. Joseph Gardello, who was an assistant dean at Harvard Medical School in 1953, so not that many years later, 6 years later, said that the Nuremberg Code was conceived in reference to Nazi atrocities and was written for the specific purpose of preventing brutal excesses from being committed or excused in the name of science. The code is, in our opinion, not necessarily pertinent to or adequate for the conduct of medical research in the United States. And he was speaking specifically about the first principle, that voluntary consent is absolutely essential. What he was saying is that the code was created because it had to be created in order to keep people like Nazis from doing what they did. But for American medical scientists, for medical scientists elsewhere, we didn't need this code because we understood the importance of consent, and we understood where consent was necessary, where consent can be waived, and we understood these things. The code was needlessly legalistic, and on top of that was too restrictive. In 1964, not that much later, the World Medical Assembly put out the Declaration of Helsinki, and the Declaration of Helsinki, to a certain extent, reinforced what Nuremberg said about a voluntary consent, but it did so in an interesting way. It defined two separate categories of clinical research with very distinct guidelines for consent. So they talked about non-therapeutic clinical research. So that's research that's done to learn something and not necessarily to benefit the subject, but to learn something about physiology or whatever. And they say clinical research on human beings cannot be undertaken without his free consent after he's been informed. But when you talk about clinical research combined with professional care, and here they're talking again about what we might refer to as therapeutic research. So I'm giving you a new drug to help treat your cancer, right? They're a little bit less clear on the importance of the primacy of informed consent. And the declaration says, if at all possible, consistent with patient psychology, the doctor should obtain the patient's freely given consent after full explanation. So leaving it up to the physician to decide, the physician scientist to decide when and if informed consent is necessary. And again, it's not so subtle a distinction, but it would have been a less relevant decision if, in fact, American medical scientists were taking the necessary care and were applying the thought behind the ethical principle behind the Nuremberg Code to research they were conducting in the United States. And in 1966, Henry Beecher, as one of Joseph Gardello's colleagues at Harvard, published an article. It's a much more detailed and lengthy story, but it culminated in this article published in the New England Journal of Medicine called Ethics in Clinical Research, in which he gave examples of 22 research projects, potentially serious ethical violations in experiments found in recent issues of medical journals. He notes as a footnote that 22, that he was able to find many more than 22. He in fact found 50 easily, but the editors only gave him enough space to describe 22. So the point was that it wasn't a one-off. It wasn't something that was happening occasionally. It was something that was easy to find. And further, the research had not taken place in a remote corner, but in leading medical schools, university hospitals, top government, military departments, government institutes, and industry. So it was something that was widespread. It included things like a study done on the liver toxicity of this old antibiotic. I've never been able to pronounce it, so I'm just going to call it an old antibiotic. And it published in the New England Journal of Medicine, so a frontline medical journal, which they describe, and these are quotes from the article, 50 patients, including mental defectives or juvenile delinquents who are inmates at a children's center. They noticed on giving this antibiotic, there was a high incidence of significant hepatic dysfunction. So they did 8 patients with hepatic dysfunction underwent a liver biopsy solely for the purposes of the research. And then after the liver function test returned to normal, 4 of the 8 patients received a challenge dose of the drug and were biopsied a second time, again, just for research purposes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any of these, but these were in frontline medical journals. In the journal Anesthesiology, 31 patients, 27 female, 29 Negro. Perhaps pay attention to the overabundance in both cases of vulnerable populations. And this was a study where they, while people were under anesthesia for clinical indications, the surgeon went on for an additional 2 to 4.5 hours, and they added carbon dioxide to the system to see if they can cause ventricular arrhythmias, abnormal heart rates. And there was no subject in whom we couldn't get a carbon dioxide level high enough to cause a ventricular arrhythmia, a life-threatening arrhythmia. Beecher noted that consent in any fully informed sense may not be obtainable, and nonetheless it remains a goal toward which one must strive. But in only 2 out of the 50 examples originally compiled was consent even mentioned. And Beecher sums it up by saying, yes, this was a problem, but perhaps the bigger problem rather than informed consent was that the investigators were not safeguarding the subjects. And he says, consent should be emphasized in all cases for obvious moral and legal reasons, but it would be unrealistic to place much dependence on it. A far more dependable safeguard is the presence of a truly responsible investigator. And he was implying these investigators were not being responsible in taking care of subjects under their control. Let's switch to Staten Island. This is Willowbrook State School. Willowbrook State School was initially built in the 1930s as a home for children with developmental disabilities. It became a military hospital during the Second World War and was finally occupied by taken over by the state of New York afterwards, and was a home to up to 6,000 children and adults with developmental disabilities. It was a horrible, terrible place. It was filthy. Again, Life magazine published pictures. This is what was going on in this place. These are people. These are human beings who are sitting around in their own filth at Willowbrook Hospital, and consequently, infectious diseases were endemic at the hospital, including hepatitis. I don't know. In a previous iteration of this talk, I didn't put down who this was, and just to see if people would recognize who. Geraldo Rivera in 1972. This is how he achieved his fame, was breaking the story about the horrible living conditions at Willowbrook State School. But in the context of Willowbrook State School, and especially in the context of the endemic infectious diseases, people like Saul Krugman, who was a great basic scientist and great clinical clinician who was responsible for most of the early information about hepatitis, did his work. And remember, in the 1950s and 1960s, it wasn't apparent that there were different, wasn't even clear what was causing hepatitis, wasn't apparent that there were different types of hepatitis with different natural histories and different modes of transmission. So he did a series of experiments at Willowbrook on the studies of natural history and prevention of hepatitis. And this is from, that was obviously an article in New England Journal. This was a consent form. What he, in one series of experiments, what he took were people, children coming into the facility who did not have hepatitis, and he was infecting them with hepatitis. And he did this with the justification that virtually everybody would get hepatitis coming into the facility. So he infected them in a controlled setting, studied the natural, so he could study the natural history of the disease. In fact, in some of these cases, there was some version of informed consent that was obtained. And this is from 1958. For parents, virus is introduced and gamma globulin given later to some, so that either no attack or only a mild attack of hepatitis is expected to follow. This may give the children immunity against the disease for life. We'd like to give your child the benefit of this new form of prevention. Now, there's any number of things that are wrong with this consent form, including the fact that it doesn't really describe what went on in the experiment. The consent form seems to say that all children would get a vaccine against hepatitis. It wasn't a vaccine, and only half of them got it. It was alleged that parents who enrolled their children in the study, and please understand that parents didn't do this, didn't put their children in this facility voluntarily. There were no other options. There were no facilities, nicer facilities available. Most people didn't have the wherewithal to be able to take care of a child with a severe developmental disability at home. So this was the only option. But the only way they could be enrolled into this at Willowbrook was going through the hepatitis unit. And later, when admissions were closed at the facility, the only route for admission was through the hepatitis unit. And then it was a deliberate attempt to infect children as opposed to studying the course of disease. Krugman used to say up to 90% of children would get hepatitis coming into the facility. Well, he made sure that 100% of children got it because he infected 100% of them. This is still a sore spot. And honestly, a point of argument up to Krugman's death. He was publishing articles in the Journal of Infectious Disease, a prestigious journal, attempting to justify this. And there is some, there are some piece of it that can be justified, but nonetheless, this was an incredibly vulnerable population with perhaps these ethical concerns being raised about this study. The high point or the low point of research ethics, though, in the United States has got to be the Public Health Service syphilis study. And one of the reasons why this is so important is it directly led to the regulations under which we operate now. And the Public Health Service syphilis study, which used to be called the Tuskegee study, was started in 1932, was sponsored by the United States Public Health Service. The purpose was to study the natural history of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. Now, there was some data available on the natural history of untreated syphilis in the white male. The Oslo study took place between 1890 and 1910. It was done at the Oslo Venereal Clinic. The director of that clinic in 1890 decided that he didn't have any good therapy for the gentlemen who were under his care at this clinic. So he just stopped treating them. I mean, the treatments available were mercurial ointments and various heavy metals, and were incredibly toxic and not at all effective. And so he just stopped treating them. And then, so between 1890 and 1910, he had a cadre of people, of men with syphilis who had no treatment for the disease, and he could study the natural history of untreated syphilis in these white men. In 1910, Paul Ehrlich started coming up with his compounds 606 with salvarsan, the neo-arsenic compounds that showed some efficacy against a variety of different microbes. So they started treating the people at the Oslo clinic with these drugs. So the study ended. But as J.E. Morse said, syphilis in the Negro is in many respects almost a different disease from syphilis in the white. Therefore, he thought that such a study, as we have complicated, would be of immense value. So the subjects in this study were 400 Black men with syphilis from the rural South. It's important to point out, nobody was given syphilis in the course of this study. They'd all acquired in the usual manner. There was another set of studies that were done by some of the same investigators in the U.S. Public Health Service in Guatemala, where they did try to infect Guatemalan soldiers, prisoners, and prostitutes with syphilis. They were singularly unsuccessful at doing that, but there in those studies they were trying to infect people. In this one, this truly was a natural history study. However, the subjects were not fully informed what they were participating in. This is I won't call it a consent form. This was more of an advertisement for the study, and what this describes a series trying to encourage these men to come in for their follow-up examinations. And what I've circled in red is, remember, this is your last chance for special free treatment. Be sure to meet the nurse. This was a special free treatment they were getting. This was a lumbar puncture being performed in the 1930s and 1940s, which was done solely for research purposes. There was no therapy that was associated with this particular thing. Early on in the study, there was an attempt to treat some of these men with some of the available therapies, but the study rapidly ran out of money for the therapy part of it, so it continued just as a natural history study. So these gentlemen were told they had bad blood. Bad blood certainly meant syphilis, but it also meant a variety of other diseases. So they never told what they really had, and they underwent procedures that were done just for research purposes under the assumption that they were being treated for their bad blood. But there was no real treatment for syphilis in the 1930s and 1940s until penicillin came around. And it became apparent that penicillin would change the natural history of syphilis. And the people who were conducting this experiment did not want to alter the natural history study that was going on. So these gentlemen were routinely denied treatment with penicillin, even when penicillin became available. This is an editorial cartoon from 1972. The doctor is throwing a tattered-looking blanket over the head of a patient who has just died. At the foot of the bed, it says, "Ignore this syphilis patient, the experiment in progress." And the nurse is saying, "Now can we give him penicillin?" And this wasn't too far off the mark. This is, it was known back in 1943 that penicillin was effective for treatment of early syphilis. But for gentlemen who are joining the Army, and many of these subjects, many of poor Black men in the South wanted to join the Army because they could be assured of 3 solid meals a day. In order to join the Army, you had to have a syphilis test, and if you were positive, you got a butt full of penicillin. And this is from a letter from the Assistant Surgeon General to the Director of the Bureau of Preventable Diseases in Alabama. And he is acknowledging that they furnished the draft boards with a list containing 256 names and asked that these men be excluded from the list of draftees needing treatment. The board agreed in order to make it possible to continue the study on an effective basis. That is, to make sure they weren't treated so they can continue to study the natural history of syphilis. Again, the investigators were not ashamed of what they were doing. They published in the Archives of Internal Medicine the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis. There was some outcry. There was some notice taken by people who read the article. This is a letter from Erwin Schatz, a cardiologist in Chicago, to one of the investigators, that he was utterly astounded by the fact that physicians allow patients with a potentially fatal disease to remain untreated when effective therapy is available. Partly in response to the sporadic outcry from the community and to some concern from within the Public Health Service, in February of '69, the Centers for Disease Control convened a blue ribbon panel to review the study, specifically to ask whether the study should be halted and the patients given penicillin therapy. And the panel concluded with one dissension that treatment would not help the subjects, and therefore the study should continue. It's important to note that, and noted by people who have subsequently looked at this commission, that it was made up by people who were participating in the experiment, by the investigators or other people who understood, who knew the study. They were judging their own work. And Lawton Smith, who was a prominent ophthalmologist who had made his fame, if you will, by studying ophthalmologic complications of syphilis, said, "You'll never have another study like this. Take advantage of it." Because this was going to be the last cadre of people who had untreated syphilis now that penicillin was available. Ultimately, in 1972, David Buxton from the Public Health Service talked to Gene Heller, a reporter, and this ended up in the Washington Star and then in the New York Times. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. For 40 years, the United States Public Health Service conducted a study in which human beings with syphilis have gone without medical treatment. The study was conducted to determine from autopsies what the disease does to the human body. And so after this expose, the Public Health Service commissioned an ad hoc study panel in 1973. The ad hoc study panel didn't mirror the Blue Ribbon CDC panel. It was made up of people distinct from the research. They concluded that the study was ethically unjustified, should be stopped immediately, and necessary subjects be given remaining subjects be given necessary medical care. And they were also charged with looking at more broadly the protections for human subjects. And they found that neither the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which own the Public Health Service and the CDC, nor any other agency in the government had adequate policies for oversight of human subjects research. So as a result of this, in 1974, under the leadership of late Senator Edward Kennedy, Congress passed the National Research Act, which established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The National Commission was given a number of different charges, one of which was to recommend regulations to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects. And another one was to identify the basic ethical principles that should underlie the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research. In response to their first charge in 1978, they published the report and recommendations on institutional review boards. And what they said in the preface is that investigators should not have the sole responsibility for determining whether the research involving human subjects fulfills ethical standards. Others who are independent of the research must share in this responsibility. Perhaps they were thinking about the CDC Blue Ribbon panel made up of investigators evaluating their own research. But from this report comes the notion of IRBs and, in fact, the regulations under which IRBs operate. Those regulations, 45 CFR 46 subpart A, is a basic policy, was originally adopted in 1981, originally just for HEW, then subsequently HHS funded or conducted research. But in 1991, 10 years later, another 15 federal departments and agencies joined in with the HHS regulations under something called the Common Rule. So it's now up to 17 agencies that have essentially the same set of regulations which control research that is funded by or conducted by those agencies involving human subjects. So we were dealing with essentially 1981 regulations up until 2019. That's almost 40 years. And while the regulations were based on a good, sound ethical basis, they were written in the 1980s, and they were written for research in the 1980s. So it was primarily done at universities and done at single institutions, and didn't think about big data and didn't think about xenotransplantation, didn't think about a lot of the nuances we had now. And so the regulations, although they were good and solid from an ethical point of view, were fuzzy around the edges and were not quite as relevant to science now as they were at the time they were constructed. So we in 2019 we finally had a revision to the common rule, updated some of the regulations, made some of them better, frankly made some of them worse. Didn't change some things that needed to be changed, but now we have something that's a little bit more in tune with the kind of research we're doing now. So as you recall, the second charge for the National Commission was to comment on the basic ethical principles that should govern human subject research. And what the commissioners thought about this long and hard, and they met at the Belmont Conference Center in Northern Virginia. So the report they published was called the Belmont Report. And what they basically said was, there are lots of ethical principles that come into play when you use somebody towards your own ends. And then fundamentally, that's what research is. We are using human beings toward our own ends. Our own ends may be laudable. They may be very fine goals, that is to find a cure of cancer, to treat a disease, but it's primarily somebody else's goal. If we help the subject, God bless, that's a wonderful thing also. But the main point of research is to generate knowledge to help other people. So in this context, when you use people for your own ends, there are lots of principles that come into play. The most important ones in this setting, they thought, were the principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And respect, I've heard it say, and I like quoting this, none of these are new and novel thoughts. This is exactly what your grandmother taught you when you were growing up. This is be good, be nice, be fair. So respect for persons says that people have a right to control their own lives. And if they're capable of making their own decisions about their values, goals, and priorities, they ought to be allowed to do that. And so from this principle of respecting a person, respecting their autonomy, their ability to make their own choices, comes the practical application of informed consent. You asked for permission. Does this sound a little bit like Nuremberg from 1947? Respect for persons speaks to the requirement for informed consent. There's a second part of respect for persons, though. You should make your own choices when you can make those choices. But if you can't make those choices, you need to have somebody make those choices for you in a way that protects you. And there are lots of situations where people can't make their own choices. Because they have cognitive disabilities, because they don't have legal authority to do it, because they're too young, because they're in a situation that constrains their choices, that limits the amount of things they can do. In those cases, those people don't have full autonomy and they're not able to make their own choices. So respecting them as a person means that we have to protect them. So the second half of respect for persons says for vulnerable populations, we have an obligation to protect them. So the practical application of that is additional protections for vulnerable populations. Beneficence just means do good. And as a corollary, beneficence is non-maleficence, don't do harm. And so the principle of beneficence says research should do good, and research should maximize good, and research should minimize harm. So from this principle of beneficence comes a practical application of the risk-benefit analysis. Research has to produce more good than it produces harm. And if you'll remember back to Nuremberg, that was one of the Nuremberg principles. And the final principle is a principle of justice. That is, we're talking here about distributive justice. There should be a fair distribution of both the benefits and the risks that go along with research. Research should provide benefits to everybody who can get benefits, and should protect everybody who can be protected. So the principle of respect for beneficence correlates to the practical application of an equitable subject selection. Make sure everything is done ethically, within reason, of course. So in 2000, Zeke Emanuel published in JAMA his interpretation of the ethical principles that should govern human subject research. And a lot of people thought that he was, there was quite a mantle he was taking on himself to elaborate on what the commissioners had done, but nonetheless, it's what we have. And he said, yes, certainly respect for persons, beneficence, and justice come into play, but he thought that there are other things that ought to be considered when talking about what makes research ethical. And here's how it works. First, we discover the drug and identify the market, then we invent the disease. So the first requirement for ethical research is it must have social value. That is, the research has to ask an important question. There's got to be valuable for improving health and or basic scientific knowledge. Again, this was one of the Nuremberg principles, that the research has to have value. And Zeke was just elaborating on that. Find out who set up this experiment. It seems that half the patients were given a placebo, the other half were given a different placebo. And this speaks to the fact that for research to be ethical, it has to have scientific validity. The research must be able to answer a scientific question that has been posed. And what he said was that for clinical research to be ethical, the methods must be valid and feasible. The research must have clear scientific objectives, be designed using accepted principles, methods, and practices, have sufficient power, and offer a plausible data analysis plan. It must have scientific validity. Now, scientific validity is actually something that IRBs get called on all the time. We're forever being yelled at for looking at the science behind research. And the usual litany is something like, you ought to be looking at ethics, not science. Well, that's a ridiculous distinction. CIOMS, the Council for International Organizations of Medical Scientists, back in 2002 said this, I think better than anybody else has said, is that scientific review, looking at scientific validity, and ethical review cannot be separated. Scientifically unsound research on human subjects is unethical in that it may expose subjects to risk or inconvenience to no purpose. If there's no scientific validity that comes out of the research, then the risk-benefit relationship is never acceptable. No matter what the risks are, even if they're only the risks of inconvenience, if there's no benefit, no scientific validity, then the risk-benefit relationship is unacceptable. Do a double-blind test. Give the new drug to rich patients, the placebo to the poor. No sense getting their hopes up. They couldn't afford it even if it works. So this speaks to the ethical principle of fair subject selection, which is not far away from the Belmont principle of justice. Historically, and as I've suggested to you before, riskier non-beneficial research is disproportionately enrolled vulnerable populations. Look at the study of carbon dioxide causing arrhythmias. Look at this, the study of the antibiotics. Look at the target audience of that. And then, in fact, look back at the experiments done in the concentration camps. These were vulnerable populations, certainly. The scientific goals of the study should be the primary basis for determining the groups and individuals who are going to be enrolled. Fair subject selection requires that both the benefits and burdens of research be distributed equitably. So that is, the research should not inappropriately target a group for inclusion, especially if that group is vulnerable, and it shouldn't inappropriately exclude a group who might benefit. As a pediatrician, I feel very strongly about that because research typically excludes children as a way of protecting those children, but sometimes we protect them to the point of not getting any data. And and there are numerous episodes where children have been harmed because we didn't have data about a drug. And we didn't test it in children in order to protect them. We didn't have data about it, and we didn't find out until later that it was dangerous to them. Think about tetracycline. Think about chloramphenicol. These are common antibiotics that were tested in adults, not tested in children, to protect the children. But we didn't learn that the drugs were actually metabolized differently in children and caused different problems in children. Surprisingly enough, this is in the range of acceptable risk. Another key feature of the ethical basis of research is the risk-benefit balance. We've talked about this in the context of the Belmont principle of beneficence. That is, risks should be minimized, potential benefits should be maximized, should be enhanced. And the potential benefits to individual subjects and to society must outweigh the risks of the research and the risk-benefit analysis. And in fact, that's translated directly into the regulations under which we're obligated. One of the regulatory criteria for approval is that risks of subjects are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits of any of the subjects and the importance of the knowledge that may reasonably be expected to result. That's the risk-benefit analysis. Risk-benefit is central to what we do. Risk-benefit is something we all do, is central to what we do in the IRB, but it's also something that we do as human beings every day of our life. We sit down at lunch and we decide whether we want that double bacon cheeseburger or whether we're going to have a salad with vinegar on it. We want the double bacon cheeseburger because it tastes great, but it's got 1,000 grams of fat. We order the salad, or some of us do. I don't, but some of us do, because it's low in fat and it's healthy for you, but it tastes like a salad with vinegar on it. So we do that risk-benefit analysis based on our own values, goals, and priorities. And risk-benefit in some cases can be more complicated in the research world. Consider for a second a phase 3 study. So that's a comparative efficacy study of A versus B, right? Of a placebo-controlled trial, a sugar pill versus a new drug in patients with, let's say, relapsing multiple sclerosis. And the parameters of the trial say that the drug, the data we have says that the drug is expected to produce significant but short duration improvement in some subjects. And the parameters of the trial say that subjects on the placebo cannot get the standard therapy for the duration of the trial. So whether you think this is an ethical trial or not, you have to admit that the risk-benefit analysis of this trial is more complicated than double bacon cheeseburger versus salad. And it gets more complicated still. This is a picture of baby Faye. Baby Faye was born in 1984 with a hypoplastic left heart. And a hypoplastic left heart, for those of you who are not pediatricians, is a cardiac birth defect that's incompatible with life ex utero. The left side of the heart doesn't develop adequately, so there isn't enough pumping to get the blood around. So this was a uniformly fatal disease. In 1984, there were starting to be some palliative operations, some plumbing operations where they tried to reroute the blood vessels so the right side of the heart would do the work of the left side of the heart, and it just didn't work. But also in 1984, we started to have access to something called cyclosporin, which is a drug that would tone down T cells, immune cells. And with it brought the prospect of transplantation by turning down the immune system. So baby Faye in 1984 received a baboon heart, and she lived for 18 days and then died, then rejected the heart. So again, consider the risk-benefit relationship for baby Faye. Consider the risk-benefit relationship for her mother and her grandparents. Consider the risk-benefit relationship for the investigators and for Loma Linda University, where the research was done. And consider the risk-benefit relationship for society. So risk-benefit can be really complicated, but it's central to what makes research ethical. It's central to what the IRBs need to do. Try this. I just bought 100 shares. Independent review is another feature of ethical research. We recognize that investigators inherently have multiple legitimate interests. They have the interest of conducting high quality research, doing the research expeditiously, fast, obtaining funding, and they have a legitimate interest to advance their careers. All of that are legitimate interests, but these interests generate conflicts that can put subjects or the scientific validity of the research at risk. An independent review by IRBs minimize the potential inflict of some such conflicts of interest. Consider the CDC Blue Ribbon panel looking at the Public Health Service syphilis study. That independent review there might have produced different results. At last, Igor finds a body with the appropriate consent form. Yes, in the event of my death, I'd like my parts to be used to help build Frankenstein's monster. So this speaks to the necessity for informed consent. Remember that consent is a process. Consent isn't the form. Consent is a process in which the investigator discloses relevant information, the subject has the opportunity to ask questions, the investigator answers the questions, and you keep on repeating that. That's the process of informed consent. The consent form itself is almost trivial. It's a record of the information conveyed and the fact that the subject was willing to participate. But the consent form is not consent. Consent is a process. It's a discussion between the investigator and the potential subject that goes on for days, weeks, months. Remember, this is key to, this was the first principle of the Nuremberg Code. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means the person should have a legal capacity to give consent, be so situated as to exercise free power of choice. This is the principle of respect for persons, sufficient knowledge and comprehension. Informed consent is made up of information. It requires that the subject understand that information. It requires comprehension. If you tell somebody something, but you don't tell them in a way that understands, you haven't informed them. And it requires voluntary choice. And in order for informed consent to be truly informed consent, it has to have information comprehension and voluntary choice. And what Zeke Emanuel said is, to provide informed consent, individuals must be accurately informed, understand this information, make a voluntary and uncoerced decision. So he's saying the same thing that the National Commission said in the Belmont report. How much information? The prospective subjects must be provided with the information that a reasonable person would want to make a decision. That's from our regulations. And the information has to be given to the subject in a language understandable to the subject. And remember that the use of understandable language applies not just to the consent form. We don't just translate the consent form. The process has to be in a language understandable to the subject. And it's not about translation of English to Spanish or Chinese or Urdu or Arabic. It's about translation from medical to English, because we speak a different language from our patients. We speak medical that we learned over the course of many, many years. And if the consent forms are written in English, but they're written in medical English, they are not understandable to potential subjects. I've called this meeting to discuss the lack of respect I've been getting around here lately. So the final one of the ethical underpinnings for research that Zeke Emanuel proposed was called respect for persons. And this is a grab bag that reflects the fact that you treat subjects as human beings, as participants in the research. You maintain confidentiality, respect their privacy, share information during the trial, especially that information may influence whether they want to continue on the trial or not. You monitor them, provide necessary care for injuries or adverse events, and you inform the subjects of results of the research after the trial is completed. You don't want to mess with me. I have a total lack of respect for compliance. So what exactly is an IRB? Right? Maybe I should have started with this. An IRB is a body that's formally designated to review and monitor research involving human subjects as per these regulations, 45 CFR 46 or equivalent FDA regulations, 21 CFR 56. What is human subject research? From a regulatory point of view, research is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. It's a legalistic turn of phrase. Research is one of those things that you, like the Supreme Court Justice who said, I don't know what pornography is, but I don't know how to define it, but I know what it is when I see it. Research, it's hard to define, but we have an idea what it is. But sometimes we don't. I mean, there's quality improvement research, our case reports research. You know, there are lots of things that may be on the border, they're not quite research. Systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. What's a human subject? A human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research gets information of biospecimens through intervention or interaction. So if I poke you like the Pillsbury Doughboy to see if you're going to laugh, and if I'm doing that to collect data about whether you're going to laugh, and I'm doing that in the context of research, you are a human subject to that research. Or it is if a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research gets identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. So if I look in your medical record, even if I don't ever meet you and I get identifiable information, I do that about in a research context, you're a human subject. If I go to the laboratory and I get a little bit of your pancreas that has your medical record number on it, and I do that for research purposes, you are a human subject of research. What's the authority of the IRB? Our regulations say we have the authority to review and approve, require modifications in, or disapprove all human subject research activity. And we do it for all research that's done at UNMC, Nebraska Medicine, Children's Hospital, UNO, or Bellevue Medical Center. And we do it for research that's conducted anywhere by personnel from those organizations. So if you are a UNMC faculty, student, or employee, and you go to University of South Dakota to do research, you're under the jurisdiction of our IRB. Their IRB, South Dakota's IRB, is going to take interest also, but you're certainly under our jurisdiction. How do we judge research? We judge it based on the regulatory criteria for approval that were laid out in that National Commission report and codified in the HHS regulations of 1981, the common rule in 1991, and revised in 2019. And those criteria for approval are listed right here. And each one of the, I stressed at the beginning that the regulatory criteria for approval, that the regulations we have are based on ethical principles. Well, look at these things and you see the Belmont report in them. And you see more distantly the Nuremberg Code. Risks of subjects are minimized. That's the principle of beneficence. Risks of subjects are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. That's risk benefit. That's beneficence. Selection of subjects as equitable is justice. Informed consent is obtained and documented is respect for persons, and so on and so forth. So in order for the IRB to approve research, we have to go down this checklist and say that all of these conditions are satisfied before we can approve the research. So how do you do this? You go to the UNMC IRB website, you click on the button that says online application, you fill out the application. The application is long. It's 31 questions, and each one has got a dozen sub-questions, and it goes on forever and ever because we have to have the information in order to check all those boxes. If we can't check those boxes, we can't approve the research. And you as an investigator shouldn't be participating in the research unless you could say the risks are minimized. It's not ethical. And eventually you end up pressing the button that says submit, and then it goes to the sausage factory, right? And nobody wants to know how what happens in the IRB, right? It's all a black box there. Actually, this is what happens, but the details are not important. But the end result of it is we send you a letter that says that your research is approved. We help you adjust the research so that it meets those regulatory criteria, and by implication meets the Belmont principles and meets the ethical principles laid out in that JAMA article. We help you do what you want to do, which is do good quality ethical research. All right. I hope what I hope is that in the course of this, we've gotten down to that bit. Confusion is associated with too little information or too much information. So I just want to give you a little bit more just to make sure that we get you right to that nadir there, and point out that there are other sources of information. You can in fact go on our website, the city training website. I am not putting in a plug for city, even though I was on the University of Nebraska was one of the founding organizations, and I was one of the founding partners of city. I wrote some of the modules. It is a terrible, terrible way to teach adults anything, much less something as ridiculous as ethics. But it was created at the time because there was a threat that if we don't do this ourselves, Congress is going to do it. And it's the least common denominator. But if you have a desire to go to city, click on our website, log in either with your login or through the organization, or register if you want to pay for it yourself. That's your business. And it gives you a list of the courses that are available, and you can go ahead and read more about these things. Or I'm happy, ecstatic to tell you more about any particular aspect of protection of human subjects that you want. And I can give you things to read and tests to take and all sorts of stuff. But there, now I've taught you everything I know about splitting rocks. And I'm done. And Lisa stayed awake through all of it. I'm really impressed. I'm going to stop sharing now so you can see my smiling face. Thank you all for staying awake.
Bruce, that was excellent.
I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I thank you for staying. And 34 things in the chat. Oh my God.
Oh yeah, we were talking about you, and boy. I think no, this was great, and I'll let other folks ask questions too. One of the things that I'm always thinking about as we're doing community engaged research is, what are the core principles? And I know you just went through, from the Nuremberg report to the Helsinki to the Belmont to the 2019 changes, that there's all these things. And when we have community partners that want to engage with and research with us, is the city training core content really the fundamental things that they need to know? And I guess I'm almost asking about, knowing that we want to be ethical in what we do, what's the minimum bar that would allow us to feel like we have a trained group of people that are able to do research in the way we would want them to do it.
So I will say again, as if I didn't make it clear enough, that CITI is a terrible way to learn. It is it's the lowest common denominator. So that's what we require of our investigators. And it's not even the lowest common denominator, because not everybody has the bandwidth to the time or the internet bandwidth to take it, and not everybody has the interest, and it's not a way to teach people. So yes, it is the minimum requirement by our institution, by a lot of institutions, but probably a much better way of learning about this is in conversation. And if I had to say to you, if you asked me to put my finger on what would be the best thing to read, it would be the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report, depending on the font you choose, is about anywhere from 4 to 7 pages. It's nice, it's simple, it's written by bioethicists who it was written by philosophers, but not in a way that philosophers usually write. Usually in a philosophy article, the introduction is 7 pages long. And they did they said what they had to say in 7 pages because they were good at it, but also because it's not rocket science. It's be good, be nice, be fair, right? So read the Belmont Report. If you understand that, if you understand your obligation to protect subjects' autonomy, to respect them as persons, you understand informed consent. You don't understand the regulations. You don't know the nuance of the regulations. That's what I get paid the big bucks for, right? Is knowing the nuances. So when you tell me that what do I put in my consent form? I direct you to our template that's got all the required regulatory elements in there. And when you send me something that says A, B, and C, I say, well, you can't really say C. You've got to say A, B, and D, and here's why. If you read the Belmont, you understand about minimization of risks and maximization of benefits, so you know how to construct your research. If you read Belmont, you know about equitable subject selection, so you don't aim at it, well, I'll do it on mental defectives and residents of a juvenile and delinquents from a juvenile facility, because you know that's not right. So if you had to read something, I'd say read that. If it comes, there shouldn't be anything different between community-based research and institution-based research, at least as far as ethical principles underlying those research ought to be. Except perhaps you have to make more, because in community-involved research, you often have a vested interest in the research. You have to be extraordinarily careful, as do investigators, about not losing the forest for the trees, not getting lost in the importance of the research and losing track of the fact that you are using somebody toward your ends. So maybe maybe you ought to pay a little bit more attention to that. But frankly, you give a poor assistant professor who desperately wants a promotion a research project to do, and he's going to do that research and he's going to get subjects because he desperately wants that promotion. Maybe it's not a whole lot different.
Yeah.
Yeah, to follow up to that point, Bruce, and thank you for such a great presentation. I definitely was engaged the whole time if you were worried about that. So just to follow up from what Paul asked, are you developing or in the process of developing an IRB training that's more community friendly? Because as much as I'd love to just give my community partners a one-page summary of the Belmont Report, that is not going to be something that I can upload to IRB and say that my community partners are now certified in IRB training. So is there something that we could do with our community partners that would help them be trained in IRB? Yes,
we can talk about this, and this is something that's important to us also, and we have to balance, the availability, the bandwidth that the community partners have with the requirement that they satisfy the same rules as everybody else. It's hard to say a community person only has to do a half an hour training course, but one of our oncologists has to do 12 hours of CITI training. So we have to find the balance there. But what we've all got the same goal, which is to facilitate the conduct of ethical research. And so if we can achieve that goal, if we can help your investigators to understand their responsibilities to conduct ethical research in a way that doesn't require them to take 12 hours of study, so much the better. But on the other hand, it's not a get out of jail free card. It's not, well, I'm in the community, so I don't have to do this stuff. You know, the community members have to be trained in the same way. They have to understand in the same way. And frankly, they may be more, it may hit them at a deeper level because they're the ones who might just as well be the subjects. So they might actually take an interest in this in a deeper and more fundamental way than one of the oncologists who hopes to hell he never gets cancer. So long answer to a short question. Yes, we'll work with you.
Thank you.
I have a quick question, and I hope this translates the way it sounds in my brain. So I'll try and be as clear as possible, but we have a practice-based research network, which is comprised of a number of clinics across the state. Many of them are not affiliated or associated with any medical center or hospital system that has an IRB. One of our goals in the practice-based research network is to encourage investigator-initiated research and encourage the clinicians to drive their own research projects. So in those situations, do they need to have a collaborator at an institution that has an IRB, or how do they have that IRB or ethical oversight of their research? Who's responsible for the oversight of that project?
So one of the things that didn't get fixed with the revisions to the Common Rule in 2019 was a big loophole. The Common Rule is only, you only have to follow the Common Rule if you've got research that is funded or conducted by one of the Common Rule agencies. Essentially, if you've got federally funded research, you have to follow the Common Rule. If you've got research involving an FDA-regulated drug, device, or biologic, you have to follow FDA regulations, which are 95% similar to the Common Rule. If you're doing research that is neither federally funded nor involves an FDA-regulated drug, device, or biologic, you don't have to follow any rules at all, right? Big loophole, not closed by the revision to the Common Rule. So a practice-based, somebody out in practice can experiment on his or her patients all he likes, and come under no scrutiny at all. The scrutiny may come when he tries to publish that, and the journal says, "Where's your IRB approval?" They'll say, "Oh, well, I didn't need an IRB because I'm not federally funded." My guess is the journal is going to say, "Well, find a different journal. We're not participating in this kind of nonsense." So the answer to your question is no, nobody has to review that research unless it is funded or involves an FDA-regulated product. But most people do. And so let's assume that they are going to. There are a number of different ways. You can attach yourself to an institutional IRB, and we have lots of people who we take care of. In general, we try not to do that because we don't have much control over what they can do out there, and we don't know about their training, and we don't know what's happening there. You can hire a commercial IRB to review your thing, and they will be glad to do that. And that's how most people in private practice do research, is they hire Advara, or they hire WCG, Western Copernicus Group IRBs, to do that. But those groups charge a lot of money, and they have their own vetting process. They don't just take everybody. They do require you follow the same rules. So, for your practice-based network, yeah, we might be interested in serving as the IRB of record for those people, or we might not. That's up to our institutional official whether he's willing to take that additional risk. Because if we're the IRB of record and somebody screws up, he isn't the only one getting sued. We're getting sued also. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Bruce, you had mentioned earlier about like institutions in different areas that may be working together. And I know when I worked at LA that we had some issues with IRBs harmonizing for studies that we were doing where we had researchers at the different separate institutions. So I was just wondering if you had ever run into that problem while in your tenure at UNMC,
You mean,
and then what kind
sorry,
of what were the resolutions to that, just to kind of understand if there is that IRB harmonization here at UNMC.
so you mean, you're asking, is there ever a situation where IRB 1 says yes and IRB 2 says no all the
Correct.
time?
Yes,
You get
correct.
10 IRB, the old joke is 10 IRBs, 11 opinions.
Yeah.
So yes, we're people, and we're operating on the same set of regulations, but the regulations are partly built to allow a certain amount of flexibility, and there also can be, especially the FDA regulations, can be fairly arcane and misinterpreted or interpreted differently. But in some cases, that fuzziness of interpretation is built into the regulations. For example, where they talk about the informed consent has got to be information that a reasonable person would want to know. Well, what's a reasonable person? There's a certain amount of flexibility that's built into that, but there are other situations that are just mistakes or misunderstandings or different understandings. So yes, IRBs are forever disagreeing on these things. We like to think we agree on the fundamentals, but we disagree on the trivia, but that's probably not the case either. Heck, you send the same protocol to the same IRB twice, and you may get a different answer. I mean, there's not an algorithm, there's not a computer program that does that. We are people. If the more IRBs you give, one of the big changes with the revision to the common rule is the requirement that for multi-institutional research that's funded by the federal government, you have to use a single IRB. So if we're doing the same research as UCLA, as University of Minnesota, as Duke University, all 4 of us have to use one IRB, right? And the idea is that you don't then get 4 IRBs coming to different conclusions and requiring different things. On the surface, that looks brilliant. That's wonderful, but it sort of defeats the purpose of the IRB system. If there is value in multiplicity, there is value in many people looking at the same project. If we didn't think that was important, there wouldn't be an IRB that requires there be at least 5 members. You just say, assign one person to your institution to decide whether this is okay or not. By having a board of 30 people, you get one guy who says, I don't think this is right. And the other 29 say, you're crazy. And they discuss it, and maybe one of the 29 says, you know what, you make some points there. I mean, that's, it's a difference between a jury system and a judge deciding, right? You get different opinions. So maybe it's not such a great idea that we're all using the same IRB, but that's the situation. So with regard to your situation in Los Angeles, likely now that if it was federally funded research, that would go away because only one of those IRBs would decide. The other ones would have to sit there and grit their teeth and say, you got it wrong, but nonetheless.
Yeah, before that 2019 decision, that's basically how it was handled. Is the IRBs got together and figured out who was going to be the lead IRB, and then that IRB was one.
And that's actually a good approach. Most places never got that far. They just decided we'll review it, you can review it, and we'll, never the twain shall meet.
Thank you.